whispers spread like wildfire through the gilded halls of the monarchy, rumors so shocking that courtiers dared not speak them aloud. Could it be true that Princess Catherine, the very cornerstone of the modern monarchy, was preparing to step back from her royal duties forever? For a nation that has clung to her grace, strength, and quiet defiance, the thought alone felt like betrayal and heartbreak. The idea seemed unthinkable, yet the silence within the palace was louder than any denial. Staff who once dismissed speculation with swift certainty now looked away, uneasy, as if they knew more than they were allowed to say. It was in those quiet exchanges, in those downcast eyes, that the whispers gained power. Behind polished doors and golden corridors, aides began to notice the unmistakable signs. Catherine, usually the embodiment of composure, had grown quieter, more withdrawn. She carried herself with the same elegance, but her words were fewer, her gaze heavier. Royal watchers who attended her engagements whispered among themselves, something was wrong. Those closest to her recognized the difference in the absence of the spark that had once defined her presence. Where Catherine had always seemed a pillar of strength, she now appeared fragile, as though her soul carried a weight too heavy to conceal. The turning point came when she appeared at a public outing that should have been a moment of triumph. Catherine walked with the same grace, smiled with the same restraint, yet something in her demeanor unsettled the crowd. Her posture, once unshakable, seemed tired, her movements slower, her expression clouded with an unspoken sorrow. It was subtle, but for those who had followed her every step over the years, the change was undeniable. The cameras captured it, and once the footage reached the media, the whispers ignited into a storm. Headlines multiplied across the globe, speculating about her health, her marriage, and even her loyalty to the crown. Overnight, Catherine was no longer the untouchable figure of hope, but the subject of relentless questions. Was she ill? Was she weary of duty? Or was she, as some dared to suggest, preparing to leave the life she had so carefully built at William's side? The monarchy, already fragile under the weight of Charles's fading health and the controversies surrounding other royals, now faced its most destabilizing fear: the loss of the one woman who had kept the dream of continuity alive. For the public, Catherine was more than a duchess, more than a princess, even more than a future queen. She had become the symbol of endurance, the steady anchor holding the family together amid scandal, loss, and betrayal. To imagine her stepping back was to imagine the monarchy stripped of its soul, and yet, the whispers grew bolder. For the first time, Catherine's silence seemed to speak louder than the palace's carefully crafted statements. But how did it come to this point? And what hidden battles has Catherine been fighting that no one dared to reveal until now? For years, Catherine has embodied perfection in the eyes of millions. Her poised smiles, her steady hand beside William, her elegance in crisis. Yet behind those smiles, a silent struggle was brewing. And now, the curtain begins to lift on the truth the palace desperately hoped to conceal. What the world adored as unshakable composure was, in reality, a mask forged under relentless pressure. Catherine's every movement, every word, every gesture had been scrutinized, dissected, and judged as though she carried not just the crown's weight, but the nation's very soul. To live under that gaze day after day, year after year, was no life of fairy tales. It was a battlefield of endurance. As the future queen consort, Catherine bore a responsibility unlike any other. The monarchy's survival hinged on her ability to remain flawless. A single misstep could ignite storms of criticism and damage the institution she was bound to uphold. The expectations were ceaseless. From state banquets to hospital visits, from handshakes with world leaders to comforting grieving families, Catherine was expected to embody grace, compassion, and strength in equal measure. Yet no one asked what it cost her. No one dared to question how the endless cycle of appearances drained her spirit, leaving her weary beneath the polished surface. Behind palace gates, the weight of duty was matched by the demands of motherhood. Catherine's role as a mother to 3 young children was often celebrated publicly, yet privately, it was a source of deep conflict. Every departure from home for royal service pulled her away from George, Charlotte, and Louis. moments of their childhood that slipped by while she smiled before cameras. The tug of war between family and duty grew unbearable. She was not only raising her children under the world's spotlight, but also shielding them from the same suffocating expectations that had already broken so many royals before them. This quiet torment remained hidden, visible only in her eyes when the public wasn't watching. Adding to her burden was the shadow of Camilla, whose growing influence over palace affairs stirred unease. Where Catherine was once the unrivaled figure of modern monarchy, she now faced whispers that Camilla sought to reshape the royal image in her own mold. This rivalry, though unspoken, created ripples of tension within the family. Catherine's sense of being pushed aside clashed against her duty to remain composed, leaving her torn between defiance and silence. Each passing day, it seemed as though she was being edged out of the narrative she had worked tirelessly to uphold, fueling questions about her future. William, perhaps more than anyone, saw the toll it was taking. He watched as the sparkle in his wife's eyes dimmed, as her once unshakable energy faltered. For him, it was not just a matter of royal duty, but of love and survival. He worried endlessly, torn between his role as heir to the throne and his desire to shield the woman he loved from a life that seemed to consume her piece by piece. His concern grew sharper with every passing week, every moment where Catherine seemed present in body but absent in spirit. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of warning. Catherine's distance was no longer just exhaustion from another engagement, no longer a fleeting moment of tiredness caught on camera. It was something deeper, something irreversible, as though she was retreating from a role she could no longer bear. And while Catherine's struggles were buried in secrecy, her absence soon became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a carefully crafted palace announcement that made the world take notice. It was a single public event that shifted everything. Cameras captured Catherine in a way the world had never seen her before, and from that moment, the whispers could no longer be dismissed. She appeared at a high-profile royal gathering, one of those glittering affairs designed to showcase the strength and stability of the crown. Yet, instead of radiating her usual calm assurance, Catherine seemed diminished and fragile in a way that no royal poise could disguise. Her smile was faint, her movements lacked their usual precision, and her eyes revealed a haunting detachment that unsettled even the most seasoned royal watchers. Observers whispered among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances as Catherine moved slowly through the crowd. For years, she had carried the weight of expectation with a grace that seemed unshakable. But on this night, something was unmistakably wrong. She stood beside William, who clutched her hand a little tighter than usual, as though silently begging her to hold on. Yet the distance in her gaze betrayed a woman retreating into herself, as if she were no longer fully present in the role she had been destined to play. The palace may have wanted to portray strength, but what the world saw was exhaustion and sorrow. Within hours, the images circled the globe. Headlines screamed of her visible fatigue, raising questions about her health, her happiness, and her future. The media, relentless in its hunger for scandal, began to draw comparisons to Princess Diana, recalling the moments when her emotional unraveling had been captured by cameras in similar settings. The parallel was chilling, and it unsettled a nation still haunted by Diana's tragic story. Was Catherine, too, slipping under the same crushing weight? Was history repeating itself in the cruelest of ways? The comparisons only deepened the sense of dread. Commentators noted her lowered energy, her distant smile, the lack of her usual vibrancy. The whispers grew bolder, speculating that Catherine was not simply tired, but preparing for something far more permanent. A retreat from the public stage altogether. For a woman who had always seemed to embody duty, the thought of her stepping away struck at the monarchy's very core. William, desperate to protect her, attempted to shield Catherine from scrutiny. He guided her away from the brightest lights, offered subtle reassurances in front of the cameras, and tightened the protective circle around their private life. Yet his gestures, though tender, only fueled speculation. To many, they looked less like acts of formality, and more like a husband's desperate attempt to protect a wife who was crumbling under unbearable strain. The weight on William's shoulders grew heavier, for he was not only heir to the throne, but the only barrier between Catherine and a public that demanded more than she could give. And so, a chilling realization took hold. Catherine may already have been preparing for her exit. The very woman who symbolized the monarchy's promise of renewal appeared ready to retreat, leaving behind a void too vast to ignore. The whispers had transformed into a roar, and silence from the palace only confirmed what the world feared. But what forced Catherine into this heartbreaking position? To understand, we must uncover the hidden pressures that have been crushing her from within. What the public sees as dazzling tiaras and elegant gowns, Catherine feels as chains of duty and suffocating expectations. Behind closed doors, the monarchy demanded more than even she could bear. To the outside world, Catherine was a vision of composure, always dressed to perfection, always smiling at the right moment, always carrying herself as if the crown had already been placed upon her head. Yet, that carefully constructed image was not one of choice, it was one of necessity. The royal institution, bound by centuries of rigid tradition, allowed no space for faltering, no room for humanity. Catherine was not permitted to be tired, anxious, or uncertain. She was expected to be flawless, always, for she was the face upon which the monarchy's fragile future rested. The relentless expectations of tradition were a constant weight on her shoulders. Every gesture, every phrase, every step was rehearsed in the name of protecting the institution's sacred image. She was to embody restraint when criticized, elegance when scrutinized, and strength when pressed beyond reason. To falter was not merely to fail herself, it was to risk dishonoring a dynasty. This burden was far heavier than the glittering crowns the public admired, and the truth was, Catherine never asked for this role. It was thrust upon her, leaving little space for her to breathe as an individual. At the heart of her struggle lay the demand to be the monarchy's perfect image. The palace needed her to be a fairy tale princess for the modern age, a symbol of continuity that could erase past scandals and secure future loyalty. Every outing was less about her presence and more about the image it projected. A stable monarchy led by a loving family, untainted by chaos. But Catherine was human, not a symbol, and every day she was reminded that her humanity was not welcome. Her struggles were silenced, her worries dismissed, and her individuality buried beneath the polished surface of perfection. This suffocation was made worse by the quiet conflicts with Camilla and other senior royals. Behind the polished smiles, there were sharp words and tense glances. Catherine represented the monarchy's future, while Camilla carried the weight of its controversial past, and the overlap of their influence was a constant source of unease. Whispers of rivalry grew louder, as Catherine felt her voice diminish in decisions where Camilla's sway seemed to expand. Instead of support, Catherine found herself navigating a palace where alliances shifted like shadows, leaving her increasingly isolated. The palace's obsession with legacy only deepened the wounds. Individual well-being was always secondary to appearances. Catherine's health, her peace of mind, even her family's stability, were treated as expendable so long as the institution appeared untouchable. Behind the glamour lay endless nights of exhaustion, countless sacrifices, and silent tears that the public never saw. Catherine's whispered plea for freedom, confided only to those she trusted most, was not born of rebellion, but of desperation. She longed not to abandon her duty, but to reclaim the fragments of her own soul buried beneath it. In the end, Catherine felt trapped between two worlds: the suffocating chains of the crown and the faint promise of personal peace. To step back meant betrayal in the eyes of the monarchy. To stay meant surrendering her identity to a machine that would never value her humanity. This was not a choice, it was a cage without a key. And as these chains grew heavier, Catherine reached a breaking point that not even the monarchy's power could conceal. If there was one person who knew the depth of Catherine's pain, it was William. The man destined to be king was forced into an impossible role: husband or heir. Their private conversations, shrouded in secrecy, may hold the key to Catherine's heartbreaking decision. Within the stillness of the palace, long after the cameras had been switched off and the staff had withdrawn, Catherine confided in William. She spoke not with the carefully measured words of a royal consort, but with the raw honesty of a woman breaking beneath the weight of expectation. For William, every word cut deeper than the last. He had long seen the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her smile faltered once the public's gaze had passed. Yet hearing it spoken aloud made the truth undeniable. Catherine could no longer carry this burden alone. William quietly acknowledged her suffering, though his heart ached with helplessness. He was the one person who could read the subtle shifts in her tone, the silences that spoke more than words. He did not need headlines to tell him that something was wrong. He had watched it unfold day by day. Together, they would sit in the dim hours of night, speaking of choices that seemed unthinkable. Could Catherine step away from royal duties? Could she, after years of service, walk into a quieter life? These were not conversations born of rebellion, but of desperation, whispered as though the walls themselves were listening. But every thought of freedom came wrapped in guilt. Catherine was no stranger to sacrifice, and the idea of abandoning her duty tore at her. She knew her role was not only about her own life, but about the hopes of a nation that saw her as their future queen. How could she turn her back on the crown without turning her back on the people? Her words were filled with conflict, each confession carrying the weight of someone torn between love for her family and loyalty to her country. That guilt became her prison, holding her captive between the life she wanted and the life she was forced to live. William, too, was torn apart by the choice before him. As heir to the throne, he knew his destiny was bound to the Tavor, monarchy's survival. Yet as Catherine's husband, his heart demanded he protect her at all costs. The clash between those two roles threatened to shatter him. Should he prioritize the crown, risking the woman he loved, or protect Catherine, risking the monarchy itself? In these sleepless nights, William felt the crushing reality that no answer would spare them from heartbreak. Their fears stretched beyond themselves, reaching into the uncertainty of how the public would react. Would Catherine's withdrawal spark sympathy or outrage? Would the people see her as a woman driven to her limits, or as a princess who abandoned them? The thought haunted them both. Every possible outcome carried danger, and every step forward felt like walking on fractured glass. And yet, through all of it, there was a ghost neither of them could ignore. Diana. The unspoken memory of William's mother lingered in every discussion. Her struggles, her cries for freedom, her tragic end, all stood as a warning Catherine could not dismiss, and William could not forget. For him, the possibility of losing Catherine in the same way was unbearable. He could not allow history to repeat itself. Still, no matter how much love and resolve they shared, the storm around them grew stronger. Their private vows to hold each other up collided with the unyielding grip of tradition. And while William fought to hold the family together, forces inside the palace began preparing for what would happen if Catherine truly walked away. Where Catherine saw duty as a crushing weight, Camilla saw opportunity. And in the silence of Catherine's struggle, Camilla's influence only grew stronger, leaving many to wonder, was Catherine's retreat part of Camilla's quiet triumph? While Catherine wrestled with the toll of expectations, Camilla advanced steadily, carving out a role that went far beyond the ceremonial. The queen consort's hand was now visible in decisions once thought to be the domain of Charles and his heir. Subtle yet unmistakable, her presence in meetings, her voice in strategy, and her growing confidence in shaping public perception created an imbalance that Catherine could feel pressing against her from every angle. Rumors soon surfaced that Camilla had worked deliberately to undermine Catherine's role. Insiders whispered of projects quietly redirected, initiatives delayed, and moments where Catherine's influence seemed deliberately diminished. While no one dared to speak openly, the narrative was spreading. Camilla was stepping into a spotlight that had long been reserved for the Princess of Wales. For Catherine, already weakened by the burdens of expectation, this subtle displacement felt like betrayal. She had fought tirelessly to protect the dignity of her position, only to find herself sidelined at the very moment she needed support most. The unease only deepened, as Catherine sensed the shadow falling more heavily across her path. It was not just the internal dynamics of the palace, it was the way the outside world began to interpret them. Media outlets, ever eager for conflict, began drawing comparisons between the two women. Headlines painted Camilla's rise as a symbol of resilience and strategy, while Catherine's withdrawal was cast as weakness. This public framing stung deeply, for Catherine knew the truth. Her silence was not failure, but a desperate attempt to protect herself from being consumed. Yet perception, not truth, was what shaped the monarchy's standing, and perception now tilted away from her. For William, the imbalance was intolerable. He watched as his wife, the very embodiment of the monarchy's future, was eclipsed by a figure from its controversial past. Every time Camilla's hand guided a decision, William felt his frustration grow sharper, his loyalty stretched thin. He had promised Catherine he would shield her from harm, yet he found himself fighting shadows too deeply entrenched to strike. His anger simmered behind closed doors, but even his authority could not fully halt Camilla's advance. The palace was shifting, and with it, the very narrative of the monarchy's survival. This rising tension was more than personal rivalry. It was a fracture that threatened the crown's image itself. The public, torn between sympathy for Catherine and curiosity about Camilla, began questioning the stability of the institution. If the women at its heart could not find unity, how could the monarchy claim to represent strength? What had once been celebrated as continuity now looked dangerously close to collapse. And yet, Catherine's choice was not simply about rivalry, it was about survival, and the nation would soon see just how serious her decision had become. The news spread like fire across the nation. Catherine, the people's princess of hope, may be stepping away forever. For a country that had seen her as the future of the monarchy, it felt like the ground had cracked open beneath them. The whispers that had once been confined to palace corridors were now splashed across front pages, debated on television, and dissected in living rooms. The woman who had carried the weight of modern royalty on her shoulders was suddenly at the center of a storm that threatened to shake the very foundation of the crown. For millions who adored her, this was not just royal gossip, it was heartbreak. The media frenzy reached unprecedented heights. Every photograph, every gesture, every pause in Catherine's public appearances was analyzed for clues. Commentators spoke of exhaustion, illness, and even betrayal. Some outlets framed her possible withdrawal as an act of courage, a stand against the suffocating demands of tradition. Others painted it as abandonment, a blow to the monarchy at its most vulnerable moment. The narrative fractured, but one truth was undeniable. Catherine's silence was louder than any statement. The public, too, was torn apart by grief and fear. In the streets, in schools, and across social media, the conversation was relentless. For many, Catherine was not just a royal. She was a figure of hope, a modern woman who balanced motherhood and duty, vulnerability and strength. The thought of losing her to the same crushing pressures that had once claimed Princess Diana filled the nation with dread. Tears were shed, not only for Catherine herself, but for the dream of a monarchy renewed through her presence. Global headlines only amplified the sense of crisis. Newspapers in Europe, America, and beyond painted a picture of instability, framing Catherine's possible exit as a signal that the royal family was once again collapsing under the weight of its own traditions. Comparisons to past abdications spread quickly, with pundits recalling Edward VIII's shocking decision to step aside nearly a century ago. The parallels were stark, and the implication was chilling. History, it seemed, was threatening to repeat itself, this time through Catherine's quiet rebellion. Yet within the public reaction, a generational divide began to surface. Older citizens, deeply rooted in tradition, expressed sorrow and even anger, seeing Catherine's withdrawal as a betrayal of duty. Younger voices, however, rallied in support of her, insisting that no woman should be broken for the sake of an institution. This split revealed more than just opinions. It exposed the deepening fault lines in the monarchy's relationship with the people it claimed to represent. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. The monarchy scrambled to contain the narrative, releasing carefully crafted statements that sought to reassure without confirming anything. Yet, every attempt only seemed to fuel speculation further. The image of stability the crown depended on was slipping. and no amount of polished press releases could hide the truth. The monarchy was in crisis, and Catherine's silence had become its loudest symbol. But even as the world grieved, Catherine herself had one last step, to take one final decision that could either save her or destroy the monarchy's future. Every story reaches a breaking point, and for Catherine, this was it. After years of quiet endurance, she was forced to make a choice between her own life and the crown. And when her decision emerged, the palace walls trembled. It began not with a speech or a public gesture, but with something far more private than a letter. In carefully chosen words, Catherine laid out her intention to step back, not permanently from family or love, but from the suffocating duties that had consumed her existence. The letter, sealed in silence, was both an act of rebellion and an act of survival. For Catherine, it was the first moment in years that she had taken back control of her life. When William first read it, his heart broke. He pleaded with her to reconsider, his voice heavy with love, but also with the fear of what her absence would mean not only for their family, but for the nation. He knew what it meant to lose a mother to the crushing expectations of royalty, and the thought of losing his wife, even in a different way, filled him with dread. His words were desperate, his arguments filled with both reason and emotion. He reminded her of the people who adored her, the children who needed her, the monarchy that leaned so heavily upon her presence. But Catherine's resolve, though quiet, was unshakable. She listened, she wept, and still, she held to her choice. The monarchy, blindsided, scrambled to respond. Behind closed doors, aides rushed to draft statements, advisors debated strategies, and senior royals confronted one another in tense meetings. The walls of the palace echoed with panic. For Catherine's retreat was not just personal, it was symbolic. If the future queen could not endure the demands of duty, what did that say of the institution itself? The fear was not only of scandal but of collapse, of an unraveling that could not be hidden from the world's watchful eye. Yet, Catherine's strength shone in the very act of choosing herself over duty. For years, she had sacrificed her health, her happiness, and her peace in the name of tradition. This time, she would not. Her courage was not in compliance, but in defiance, in standing against an institution that had consumed too many lives before her. She knew the criticism would be sharp, the backlash intense, but she also knew the cost of silence, and she was no longer willing to pay it. The echo of Diana's legacy haunted every step of this decision. William could not ignore the parallels. A woman beloved by the people, crushed by expectations, seeking freedom at the expense of royal approval. The memory of his mother's fate weighed on him, deepening the pain of Catherine's choice. But unlike Diana, Catherine's retreat was not a collapse, it was a declaration. She was determined to live, even if it meant stepping away from the throne that had long been her destiny. The symbolic meaning of her decision was undeniable. A future queen walking away was more than an individual choice. It was a seismic moment in royal history. It redefined loyalty, questioned tradition, and forced the world to confront whether the crown itself was sustainable in the modern age. Catherine's choice was not only personal, it was historic. But while Catherine may have stepped back from duty, the question remains, what does this mean for the monarchy's survival? A monarchy without Catherine was once unthinkable. Now, it's reality. As the world braces for the fallout, the royal family must confront the truth. Without her, can the crown truly survive? For William, the loss is devastating. Catherine was not only his partner in marriage but his shield, his anchor, the steady presence that softened the blows of duty and shielded him from the storms of scrutiny. Without her, he faces a throne that feels colder, a destiny that feels lonelier. The man once buoyed by her strength now stands isolated, his burden heavier than ever. The image of unity that William and Catherine projected is fractured, leaving him to carry both his role and his sorrow in silence. The monarchy's image, once so carefully polished, weakens with each passing day. Catherine was the face of continuity, the embodiment of hope that the royal family could modernize without losing its dignity. Now, her absence leaves an undeniable void, one the palace cannot disguise, no matter how carefully it manages its appearances. The public sees it, the press sees it, and the cracks are spreading in plain sight. Every engagement without her, every balcony appearance missing her presence, only reinforces the perception of fragility. What was once a dynasty portrayed as unshakable now appears vulnerable, its future blurred by doubt. Into this vacuum steps Camilla, her influence growing, yet controversial. For some, she appears steady, a figure willing to absorb the duties Catherine left behind. But for others, her ascent is a reminder of the monarchy's most painful controversies, an uncomfortable symbol of survival at any cost. Where Catherine's presence inspired affection, Camilla's inspires debate, and in that divide lies a dangerous truth. The monarchy's moral authority is slipping. The shift from admiration to suspicion is slow but unmistakable, and it threatens to unravel the very trust the crown depends on. Meanwhile, the role of the younger generation, George, Charlotte, and Louis, becomes a haunting question. They are the heirs of tomorrow, yet their future feels uncertain without their mother's guiding hand in the public eye. Catherine had once promised a bridge between tradition and modernity through her children. Now the nation fears that the bridge has been severed. Who will nurture their connection to the people? Who will protect them from the very forces that consumed their mother? The silence surrounding their future is chilling, and it deepens the unease that spreads far beyond palace walls. For the people, it is nothing less than heartbreak. Catherine was their princess of hope, the living proof that the monarchy could endure without repeating its past mistakes. Losing her feels like losing the very dream of renewal. Across towns and cities, the conversation is filled with sorrow and disillusionment. The question is no longer whether the monarchy can thrive, it is whether it can even survive without her. And so, the story circles back to the haunting possibility that lingers in every headline, every whisper, every heartbroken conversation. The monarchy may be standing, but it is standing on the edge. Catherine's absence is not only a personal tragedy, it is a foreshadow of collapse, a reminder that even the oldest institutions can falter when they lose their brightest light. And so, as the palace lights dim, the story of Catherine's retreat becomes not just her personal tragedy, but the monarchy's darkest reckoning yet. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.